Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Okay. All right. Well, we want to welcome all of you today. Appreciate your time. We are going to record this, so anyone participating in the program, there's a microphone here. Also, we do have refreshments back there. We have parfaits and donuts and waters in the cooler, so make sure and help yourself throughout this program. We're going to be here from 9 to 11, and again, we appreciate all of you. My name is Mari Krashowitz. I am the Executive Officer for the Southern Utah Home Builders Association, better known as SUHBA in the community. I've been with SUHBA for about 24 years and just appreciate all of our outstanding members and all of our community partners. We appreciate the great community support here. So just to let you know who is in attendance today, we invited mayors, city council members, Washington County commissioners, city planning commissioners, city staff, state representatives, builders, developers, and several community leaders. This workshop, the Housing Supply Accelerator Workshop, is presented by the Southern Utah Land Use Task Force, and appreciate everyone that serves on that task force. I also want to give a shout out to Dixie Technical College for providing this beautiful facility today that we can meet here. Appreciate them and their great support. So I just want to say a few words and I'll announce the program. So I'm going to say a few words and then I'll turn it over to Mayor Chris Hart. And then from there we'll have Sean Guzman and then who is the Government Affairs Director for City of St. George. And then Stacy Young is a Government Affairs Director for SUHBA. And then after that, we will have a Q&A session, okay? So today, why are we all here today? We all care about our community, we all live here, and we are all concerned about it. We want to preserve our quality of life, and we want our children and grandchildren to enjoy what we have enjoyed. We want a beautiful, sustainable community. We worry about the future and we worry about our posterity and people around us that cannot afford to live here. It doesn't matter who you are, we are all concerned about housing affordability and it impacts all of us. I just want to take a second to explain my situation regarding housing. So I have triplet sons, they're 31, and then I have 8 grandchildren. My husband has 8 children of his own. His wife had passed away. So together we have 11 children. And if you add up our household with our children and grandchildren, that's 20 households needed. But here's the kicker part. Out of 11 kids, only 2 have started having children. So you can tell the great need in our community for housing for sure. I think we've come to a point that we're tired of the blame game. I think we've all participated in that, and we've all played a part. It has not gotten us very far. It's time to try something different. It's going to take all of us to give a little, to compromise. It's going to take all of us working on this challenge. Like the mayor's event that was held earlier this year, doing our part. That was a great event, and there have been improvements made in the right direction. We are seeing developments that have multi-family housing options. We're seeing smaller homes. We're seeing smaller lots with reduced setbacks. The demand for housing outweighs our supply. This has a direct impact on home costs. It's going to take all of us doing our part to make a lasting impact on housing attainability in our community. And I assume that we're all tired of just talk. How many meetings, how many events, how many discussions have you participated in that's talking about the lack of affordable housing in our community? Too many. Talking about Band-Aid fixes, listening to homeowners oppose any new multifamily developments near them. We assume you have participated in many, many discussions. I know we have. What will it take? Let's take a higher look at some solutions. The Southern Utah Land Use Task Force believes that we can take action. We can lead out in Southern Utah for the rest of the state to follow. We can prove to others that cities and builders can work together and problem solve this issue. It's possible. It's the Dixie spirit. We all recognize that local decisions are best because we know our community the best, and we want to avoid state mandates. Let's lead out and show the rest of the state what's possible. So we ask builders, developers, mayors, city council members, planning commissioners, city staff, county commissioners, community leaders to keep an open mind today. We will present ideas for you to consider. We know all of you have difficult jobs and limited time. Let's simplify processes. Let's take a look at real-life proven solutions. What are we willing to compromise? What are we willing to contribute in support of housing affordability in our community? It's going to take all of us. And so at this time, I want to turn it over to Mayor Chris Hart. Thank you.
It's my pleasure to welcome you all here today and thank you for taking your Friday morning and being a part of this discussion. I see a lot of familiar faces, which means that there's going to be a considerable amount of preaching to the choir going on here today, because we're talking about a problem that is everybody's. And I assure you that there are a lot of folks who live in our communities that don't think that's the case. So in my community, the average cost of a home right now is $800,000. I ask you, what are the two new hires in our police force going to do to find housing in my community? What are we going to do when we have to add to our public works crew or our parks and recreation crew? And this is true of every city that's represented here. Where are they going to live? We have a substantial new business coming into Ivins. Black Desert alone is going to have to hire around 2,500 people. A lot of them service workers, food service, housekeeping, and so forth. Where are they going to live? And let's get personal. I'll just echo what Mari had to say. Those of you who have children and they'd like to stay here, where are they going to live? So we're all in this together. The problem is shared by every one of us, and we are going to have to figure it out, because if we don't, you and representing the building community here today, where are the apprentice electricians and plumbers going to live that are coming out of Dixie Tech or the new high school, the new technical high school? Where are they going to stay as they begin to develop a career? So we have to find answers to this, and there are a lot of ideas being kicked around. Like many of you, I've been involved in this for a dozen years, and so much of what we've talked about failed on the practical level. And so we have to consider things that can be made to work for you, the building community, for us as cities stuck with regulation and so forth that we have to adopt and maintain. I think it's going to lead to some creative partnerships. I happen personally to have been advocating one of those for a very long time and finally seem to be gaining ground. Ways to make it possible for the essential workforce. Now often when we say that term, we're talking about people hired in education, the health fields, essential service workers like policemen and firemen and so forth. But I assure you, when you're expanding, crews need to bring additional people on to build the volume of houses that you're being called upon to build. There's an essential workforce that is specific to you as well. And every industry in this region has an essential workforce that needs to be housed. So I'm anxious for this conversation to take place today. I think that you who are representing the building community here, I think you're finding cities more open to ideas, recognizing that we somehow have to accommodate smaller and more and less expensive. And from the city standpoint, we recognize that you are involved in a marketplace. Building is your career, and you want to be successful at it. Is it fair for us to say, okay, come in our city and build $350,000 homes, knowing that it may not be possible for you to do it in the current environments that we've created in our cities? So I hope this is a productive exercise. I'm glad it's being videotaped, because there are literally thousands and thousands of people living in Washington County who need to understand this, so that there's the political will, so that there is the motivation to move this process forward and actually begin to create housing that my 2 new police officers that I'm going to swear in on the 25th of this month can look to find a place to live. I'd love it to be in my community. Right now, almost impossible. So thanks again for attending. Hope we all come together on some great ideas today.
Thank you, Maury and Mayor Hart. I want to get a feel for who's in the room today. I recognize a lot of you and consider a lot of you friends. I've known you for a long time. But how many here, so that the others that may not know, how many here are from our building and development community? Raise your hands, whether you're engineers, whatever. Okay. And then how many are from government? Whether that be elected. Okay, it's a pretty good mix here, and this is exactly what we wanted. We're glad that you're all here. When I'm up north at the legislature, I like to tell the legislators there that we down here in St. George and in Dixie are on an arc. I mean, we are different than the Wasatch Front, because we all know each other. Our kids go to school together. We interact with each other all the time. We live in each other's neighborhoods. And if we don't row together down here, then we just go in circles. And a lot of times, the ideas that they want to implement that work on the Wasatch Front don't work down here. In fact, quite frankly, I think we have better ideas than they do, and we do a better job of working together. And I think this group here today shows that. I've been asked to talk about the history of our Southern Utah Land Use Task Force. In order to do that, I need to go back a few more years to give you the history of why we have the Land Use Task Force at the state level. And many of you are aware the League of Cities and Towns works with the development community and the realtors together, and we call it the Land Use Task Force. What we try to do is get together in the interim, in between the legislative sessions, to talk about possible legislation in the upcoming session, try to resolve some differences that we might have in interpretation of statutes, clarify statutes. We don't always agree in the end. But I could tell you what we have right now is a lot better than it was about 18 years ago. In history, for my mind, I just remember it was when we were renovating the Capitol, and we weren't meeting in the Capitol at the time. Senator Al Mansell was running a bill with another legislator that basically would have gutted zoning for cities, our authority, altogether. It was the nuclear bomb of zoning. Now, other than traffic in your communities, I think zoning is probably the #1 issue that comes up and can be very contentious, and something that all of you want to guide, because what happens in Santa Clara is unique from what happens in St. George, which is unique from what Washington City wants to see and envisions in their community, which is different than what Hurricane wants. There's nothing wrong with that, and that can all be done. The uniqueness of those cities can be accomplished while still making it easier for developers to develop the housing that we need, finding affordable building affordable housing for our kids to live in. As a matter of fact, I saw Zach walk in the room earlier. Oh, Zach, and I was visiting with some friends last night, and one of them said, I don't like the idea that I have to cut back on my watering just so more people can move in. And I said, well, out of your 5 kids, we were just talking about how only 2 of them live here right now, and one of them's looking at moving away. So you'll only have 1, and you want all of them to come back. Aren't they part of that group that's going to need that water that we're saving? Because I know I have 5 kids, and only one of them's been able to afford a house, and they're all here. So it's not those people, it's our people too, right? It's our families and our friends that we want to create the housing for. And so we had a knockdown, drag out that session. It was brutal. And afterwards, Senator Bell, Greg Bell, who went on to be our lieutenant governor for a while, but prior to being senator was the mayor of Farmington. So he understood the local issues, and he understood the development issues too, because he was involved in that community. And he came to the league and said, look, we're tired of getting caught in the middle of these knockdown, drag out, bloody battles that you guys have every session. I think you need to form a committee, start meeting with developers, and bring the parties together in the interim and see if you guys can't come to some consensus on these bills. So that when the legislature convenes, we have bills that you all have vetted, you all have looked at and agreed to, and we can move forward and pass those and not be caught in the middle. And so we started the Land Use Task Force. I will tell you, the first maybe 5 years, they were very interesting meetings. I mean, there was table thumping, raised voices, people did not agree. And I also can tell you that in that group, I could think of one person in particular who Mayor Barney introduced me to, and our first introduction did not go very well. And at the end of our conversation, he said, well, we're going to beat you down this session. I said, well, we'll wait and see, because we're going to beat you down. Now he's one of my best friends up there, even though we don't always agree, but we talk all the time, and he'll call me and say, what do you think about what this city is doing? I just want a reasonable attorney's opinion on this, and we trust you. Can you give this to us? And the same thing for me. Yesterday I was talking to the general counsel for a large home builder here who had an issue, and we just talked it out, where before we would not have done that. And we were able to resolve that issue for another city. And I think right now, from my understanding, and it was one that Ross Ford, who's here from the Utah Home Builders, said it came up in yesterday's Land Use Task Force meeting up there, but we think we've got it worked out now. And that's because we've built this trust with one another that even though we don't always agree, that we can trust each other to try to vet things and see if we can work them out. Well, fast forward to down here in St. George. And a few years ago, and I can't remember, probably about 4 years ago, Stacy, Mari, when St. George City was looking at redoing we were doing an impact fee study. And you all go through this. What you're trying to do is be fair. And I know many of the elected officials in this room that get those impact fee studies back and say, we don't necessarily want to charge that much, even though we can justify it, because that's going to add to the cost of a home. What can we do to make this a little more reasonable? And I think down here, most of our elected officials have tried to do that every time we have an impact fee study. Under state law, there are certain notifications that are required, and we followed those as a city. But SUHBA was unhappy because they felt like they were not being involved early enough to give some input. And as we went through the process and they explained their point of view, to us at the city it made sense. We could follow the law and say, nope, we gave you the notice on this day, you have so long to review it, and that's it. Or we could say, we will follow the law, we have to follow the law, but there's nothing that prevents us from going to them and reaching out sooner and saying, we're looking at doing an impact fee study now. So we want you to know, and we'd like to have your input along the way as we're going through some of our drafts, after we've vetted those, and not wait until we have to give you, by law, that notification, And then do what we were doing at the legislature before, which is now have a battle right there in the public hearing back and forth over this. Why? Because we've worked hand in hand with SUHBA for years. I mean, I've been here 21 years, and I've known all the directors and all the people at SUHBA. We've always worked together. Parade of Homes, a great success for our communities. Again, we all lived through 2008. And what happened then, we realized that the development community isn't just building houses. All of us had friends that moved away at that time that haven't moved back to St. George. Why? Because their job, even though it was not building, it was related to building in some way. I'm on the hospital board, for example. The hospital took a hit because a lot of people stopped doing elective surgeries and other surgeries. Some of them put off surgeries that they actually needed because they couldn't afford it, because a spouse lost a job, they lost their job, they weren't making as much money. We're all intermeshed in our economy here, and you, those developers in this room, are an important part of our economy. And so as we were talking, I said to Stacy, you know, and Damari, and I can still remember we were outside City Hall, we have this land use task force statewide. And down here, we're all together. It's not like the Wasatch Front where it's spread apart. We all know each other. Why don't we get together and put our own land use task force together? Because it isn't just reviewing impact fees, but it's talking about inspections, for example. I mean, and this is for, are there any inspectors in the room? I just want to, okay. Oh, yes, good. We've got the top-notch inspector in the room, not meaning to offend anyone, but there are cases where you say, okay, in one city, you measure the railing from thumb to forefinger, or wrapping it around this way. Another one just measures it by wrapping a tape around it. And a home builder, like Austin, is building in all these communities. And so now you say, okay, well, you can have this railing. And I had this happen in my house in Springville when I built in Springville, where they said, okay, all the other cities around here my builder said, allow this railing, but Springville. So what we'll do is we'll put the railing in your basement, we'll put up a cheap pine thing that passes code, and then as soon as it's done, we're gonna put up your railing, right? And we look at that and say, do we really need to do that? Is there some way we can make this work better for everyone? Now we're talking about affordability, right? Is there a way that we all could get together and come up with a plan that still respects Santa Clara's look and feel that they want in their community, and Ivins and Hurricanes and Washingtons and St. George's, but makes it easier for a developer to do some affordable housing. Of course, smaller lots is one idea, right? I mean, we all could go with smaller lots, but maybe the look on those smaller lots is a little different in Washington than it is in St. George, and that's okay. If the whole goal is to come up with affordable housing, can we meet together as a land use task force and say, what are some of the proposals that we could take back to our elected officials and say, we think this works for everyone, and get that feedback? I think there's nowhere in the state that's better positioned to do this type of activity than down here. In fact, Stacy and I have talked about this and said, and I've talked to some of the home builders up north that are on the big land use task force and said, if we come up with something that we think is really unique in southern Utah that doesn't really track with current state law under LUDMA, the Land Use Development Management Act, can we do a carve out for us down here and kind of be a pilot program and see if it works down here? And if it does, maybe you roll it out across the state. And I know we've got Tom Ross here from the Home Builders Association, and he's been coming to our meetings down from Salt Lake and says, if you guys could be successful with your mini land use task force that you're doing down here, we'd like to see it in other areas, right, Ross, of the state, so that we can get the home builders together. Because as I said, and the government agencies, because as I said, now that we've been doing it this many years, we've built up this trust with them. Again, we may not always agree, but we have a trust where we could sit down and have an honest dialogue on what we can do to make things better. Some of the things that we've done at the state level, for example, is we've put some, and many of you are aware of this, we've put some time frames, some shot clocks together. Feels like a shotgun to us, so that's why I said that. But shot clocks together for us to turn around plans, and that's worked out well by and large. We've done some studies with the cities, and it looks like 90+% of the cities are complying with those turnaround times. What constitutes a complete land use application? That was something that would differ from city to city to city. And we've come up with requirements for all of you to have checklists so that when a developer comes in and says, I want to build in your city and I want to submit an application, they've got a checklist that has everything they need. It also helps staff because they can look at it and say, yep, that's there, that's there, that's there. Okay, we've got everything we need. Doesn't mean it's approved. It just means that all the information's turned in. We've talked about inspections. That's been a big topic lately. How do we get inspections done timely? And there was a lot of talk from the development community that cities weren't doing inspections quick enough. And then we went back to them and said, well, did you know that a lot of your builders are calling us and scheduling inspections when they're not ready, just so they can get in the line? So our inspector goes out there on site and the foundation's not even poured, and that means another developer who's responsible and ready to go didn't get their inspection that day when they could have because we wasted our time going over there. You guys need to step up your game too. Same thing with the plats and the turnaround times. We told them, look, we can show you how we as cities are correcting your engineer's plats. We should not have 25 corrections on those plats and turn around, because what we're doing now is paying city staff to do your engineer's job. And your engineer's not giving you any credit back for the money they're charging you, and yet we're doing your work. So those are the kinds of dialogues we've had where we've been quite frank with one another and tried to figure out ways to make them more responsible for turning in good plans, and also our cities more responsible in turning those around. Another issue was phasing of projects. There were some cities that said if you have a multiple phase project, you have to finish the first phase first before you could go on to the second phase. Now, I'm not sure why that would be in most cases, especially when we're here talking about a Housing Supply Accelerator Workshop, but then we're making them finish one phase before they start the next. If they've got the financing and they're ready to go, wouldn't we rather them start that phase now and get those lots out there for sale? And yet we have some cities that were pushing back on that, so we had to do some legislation saying, nope, you can't do that. If they're phasing it and they turn in their plans and they meet all the requirements, you have to review that and approve or deny that plat as it comes in. Another big issue is the property rights ombudsman. We've been using them more and more. How many of you have ever used the property rights ombudsman for an opinion? Okay, good. Did you feel like it was useful?
Yeah, I used to do right-of-way acquisition work, and they're a great resource.
Yeah, we found by and large it was a good thing. I remember when I was working for the Association of the Counties at the time that they created this. I wasn't really in favor of it, didn't think it was a good idea, but we found more and more that what it's helped do is bring the parties together when there's a disagreement and hopefully avoid them going to court. But let's talk about going to court. We also have found that a lot of judges do not have land use law expertise, which then makes it very difficult for us when we go to court because both sides are trying to educate the judge on what land use law is. So it's turned out to be more and more of a crapshoot on whether they get it right. And I cast no aspersion on judges because I love all judges. I don't like all attorneys, but I love all judges. So we are now batting around the idea back and forth on whether we should have three or four judges that just go around the state and hear nothing but land use law cases so we can get those moving quicker and get good decisions on those. Those are some of the issues we're tackling up there. Coming back locally again, we are looking at, as we said earlier, how can we improve the process so that you can, as developers, get out there and develop product that is in that affordable range. We can't force you to. That's the problem. I met with the governor last year, and he was asking me about the situation in southern Utah. And interestingly enough, I had just done a presentation to an interim committee up there at the Capitol where I showed them that out of the metropolitan statistical areas, there's Ogden, Clearfield, Salt Lake City, Provo-Orem, and St. George. Out of all those, guess who had the lowest income by about $20,000 on average? St. George. Guess who had the highest rent for a 2-bedroom apartment? This one should be easy. Salt Lake City. Guess who was number 2? St. George. And then I pointed out to him that I pay 15 cents a gallon at the Maverick here more than I paid in downtown Salt Lake that day when I gassed up my rental car before I went up to the Capitol. I said, it is more expensive to live down here for our people. Our housing is less affordable. But Governor, part of this problem is we could zone our whole city R16. We could do it all R15. But that doesn't stop a developer from coming in and saying, I'm going to develop 10,000 square foot lots or 12,000 square foot lots. Said, where's our stick to say if we zone these small lots, they are going to build small lots? See, these are some of the things that we want to talk about together with you all on this land use task force to say, what are some ideas that can get us to that affordable housing level? So right now, and we're going to have a Q&A session that I would really like all of you, I see some of you have your pens out, I'd like all of you, as you're listening to what Stacy talks about next, and some of the things that maybe I've mentioned here, write down some things that you think could be done, either on the city side for your government people or on the developer side that could help us get those affordable housing units. And keep in mind that for St. George, for example, and John, I hope I'm not speaking out of turn, or Natalie, but we don't want to see all these necessarily grouped in one neighborhood. I could give the example of driving down Valley View and you just see all apartments the whole way, right? That's what it feels like. And then some PUDs. But why can't these smaller lots be interspersed with 10,000 square foot lots? So that those people aren't living in that neighborhood. They're living in a normal, that quote unquote, that neighborhood. They're living in a neighborhood with everyone else they can interact with. Why can't we do something like that and still have those affordable homes in there? I mean, we want to think differently than what's been done in the past. And lastly, I'll say, going back to how we want to be able to keep you having your unique communities, I just testified on Wednesday at an interim committee about ADUs. And Farmington was there. Mayor Silvestrini from Mill Creek was there and testified, and then I did for St. George. And we all had different approaches to ADUs. But all of them were great ideas, I thought. But it was a great idea for Mill Creek. And Farmington's come up with an idea. I almost hate to throw this out because it's not something I think would work here. But they want to do ADUs where you actually can carve out, they'll have maybe an easement of a driveway going to the back, and then carve out a separate lot. And then now you have 2 lots on that instead of 1. I don't know that works for what we want to accomplish down here, but we still can accomplish what we want with an ADU and getting some affordable housing. And I pointed out not just for young people, but down here for a lot of seniors that cannot afford a $2,000 a month rent for their apartment, that they could live in one of these ADUs too. But we could come up with our own unique ideas on what works down here. So I just have a few more minutes. We're going to do a Q&A, but I just like to hear from you some ideas that you think would help us come up with more affordable housing. Michelle.
Yes. Well, thanks, Sean. Great presentation. I think one thing that gets overlooked that we don't talk about enough is let's start with the low-hanging fruit, the fact that there is not a resort community in this country that actually has affordable housing. And we as government have incentivized us to essentially become a resort-style community, which is enhancing the problem with housing. So I think at a minimum, we could stop incentivizing that as government.
Well, and there's a lot of people that feel like we've advertised enough, people know right where we are. I think Mayor Hart brought up a good point that we were asking in our last meeting, and that is, we've got Black Desert coming in. How many employees are they going to have? A lot, hundreds, right?
Well, yeah, 2,500.
2,500. Where are they going to live? Entrada? Kayenta? I don't think so. Where are they going to be driving? Maybe not in Ivins, maybe in St. George and Santa Clara to get there. I mean, what happens in one of our spaces affects everybody, but what are they going to do? We're going to start a bus route to Zion, which will be a great thing to help relieve some of the parking. But John, what was the percentage of those that we project on that bus that are just going to be workers going out to Springdale? It's like 70%, 60%. They're going to be employees that can't live in Springdale or Rockville, right? There's nowhere for them to live. So I think that's a very good point. I mean, we're bringing in we have these hotels and other hospitality type related businesses, and people cannot afford to live. And if you don't think there's a problem, go up to our food pantry. It's now where the old, was it Tinks before? It was where the auto part. Oh, ABC Auto right there behind Tom's Deli out off of Bluff Street that Switch Point just purchased. There is a line of people, and those people are actually working, but they're working in the hospitality industry, and they're paying $2,000 a month rent, $1,800 a month rent, so they can't afford food. So they're going there to help supplement their food. So I think that's a good point.
To be clear on that too, is I'm not against resorts or, big events coming here, but we also have to be honest with ourselves that as government, if we are incentivizing these things, going out of our way to have these things here, it's bringing in those multimillionaires from California who don't bat an eye at paying $2 million for a home, which keeps prices high. So we just need to be realistic that these TRT funds that we're using for marketing, that's not helping the housing situation.
Right. It isn't. In fact, I was talking to some Park City officials at the league meetings, and some from Heber, and they were saying it used to be Heber where all their workers came from, right? But guess what the housing prices have done in the Heber Valley? Now it's like pretty exclusive. So now they're saying we have nowhere for these people to live that are working here. So and you're right. If we're incentivizing, we should. We want to work together with all of you. And with that, I'm going to turn the time over to Stacy Young.
It's been a really good discussion this morning. Appreciate you all coming out and making some time to engage in this important topic. Maybe to kind of start, how many of us in the room are renters currently? Anyone? How many of us have ever been renters? Of those of us who have been renters, was there ever a time that you decided not to contact your landlord because you were afraid of your rent going up or getting evicted or something? You had some issue in your house, maybe it was even unsafe. To me, so this is really fundamental stuff. It's really personal.
Can you hold the microphone lower?
Is this better? Oh, I see. Okay. This is really personal stuff, and what I'm about to get into is kind of the policy stuff. And once we go down that rabbit hole, a lot of times we kind of lose sight of the personal nature of this and how impactful this is, how it affects not just where we live and where our kids live, but our access to opportunity, to jobs, to good schools, et cetera. Picking up on some of what Sean was saying, the Southern Utah Land Use Task Force, as we formed it in earnest a few years ago, as he mentioned, it was really to try to open a wider band of communication between the private sector and the policymakers on the city side of the process. And within that, it was a goal to share best practices, lessons learned across the county. You'll hear me probably bring this metaphor up multiple times. The land use policy of a city is kind of like its operating system. And if we're doing business across the county and not in just one city, we're essentially having to change operating systems every time we change jurisdictions. And some of those differences make a lot of sense, as Sean alluded to. There are legitimate reasons why one city may want to do things a bit different than the other. But there's also a lot of reinvention of the wheel that is creating waste and isn't benefiting anyone. It's not to your benefit as a city, nor to ours as builders. There's so many familiar faces in the room. I forgot to really introduce myself to those of you who don't know me. My name is Stacy Young. I'm a local developer and land use attorney, and also the government affairs director for the Southern Utah Home Builders Association. Been here for 28 odd years now. And as we had these conversations over the last few years, what we noticed were two things. One, that the housing crisis continued to get worse, and so I think we started to think a little bit more ambitiously and feeling like we needed to maybe be a little bit more aggressive in some of the policy discussion that we were having. And we noticed recurring themes in terms of what the priorities and concerns were from either side of the community. And I labeled a couple of those here. I don't know that I've come up with the very best labels for them, but you can kind of see what issues came up again and again in those conversations. And so as we talked, what we wanted to do was, as best we could, identify solutions that would fit in that overlap, where we're both addressing city concerns and builder goals as well. So real quick, what we're going to spend just a minute with a little bit of background, a little bit of data, a little bit on kind of the nuts and bolts of zoning, kind of unpack that a little bit, and then get into what we're here really to ask you to consider engaging on with us. So start with some good news. The good news is not the level of the line there. I mean, we've got an existing median home price of over $500,000 still. But the good news is that it's flat. So at least the crisis is not getting worse. That's maybe small comfort, but for some time now, prices have been flat. The second thing you may note there is that the purple line is the median price of new construction. And new construction is now actually nearly $50,000 lower than resale inventory. So that is a sign of some positive things. We've talked about it a little bit already today. Even prior to the worst of the crisis that has hit us within post-pandemic, cities and builders were already trying to shift to meet the need and the preferences of the next generation, smaller homes, smaller lots, et cetera. And so largely what you're seeing in that shift is compositional, meaning a brand new home on a large home on a large lot is going to be more expensive than a comparable one that's a resale. But more of our new homes are in that more entry level type of segment. We also our economy has grown. Let's not lose sight of the fact that the growth has an upside to it. Our GDP has gone from about $57,000 countywide as a household in 2018 to over 82,000. That's real numbers, and so that's something we should keep in mind. And undoubtedly, that's going to be part of the affordability solution as well. Is not just holding the line on home prices, but seeing real wealth accumulation and increases in household income, so that even if the nominal price of a home is still eye-watering, at least in real terms. It's more affordable to more of our community. Utah is a relatively still an open access state. We are building on a pro rata basis more new housing than most of the country. We're kind of at the top of those the list when you look at them. And that's a great sign in terms of the supply and demand issue. We know that labor is a challenge, certainly within our industry, as it is in many. But locally, and we're sitting in a representation of that. We've built a really good pipeline locally of talent for the construction trade. So we have at least a relatively good situation in terms of that. And again, builders and cities are taking steps in this direction, and we should not lose sight of that. This is the top 10 new home projects across the county, and what you'll notice is that they're below that median. So these are all kind of small and starter homes. You can look at the list as you like. It's always fun to look at rankings, right? But across the top line, so the average price of these projects is about $445, 1,750 square foot homes. So these are humble homes, and they're selling. These 10 projects sell about 46 new homes per month. That's the rate at which they're selling. And so, the really high-end homes, that gets a lot of the attention, and for obvious reasons. But the truth is, our industry is doing the best on a bread and butter basis to turn out housing as best we can. But we've got to turn now to a few hard realities. So obviously, the cost of the inputs to build a home sets the floor of what's possible. And sometimes there's this natural tendency to think, well, my home equity went up by 50% the last 5 years, and so builders are making 50% more money. No, we are also facing inflation on the input side of this. So this is the producer price index. So everybody's familiar with the consumer price index. This is the PPI, the producer price index for the inputs to residential construction. And as you see, the inflation that has hit us economy-wide obviously affects us. It's up, 45% roughly in the last 5 or so years. So that just sets the floor. What was feasible 5 years ago is not feasible today, just the stubborn math of it. We're also going to deal with, for some time, with mortgage lock-in with the resale inventory. So as Robert said, the new home construction side of this can only do so much. We only have a certain amount of capacity in a number of fashions. So part of the solution here is resale inventory as well. It's all housing inventory, right? And as folks are locked into 3% mortgages, the mobility has shrunk quite a bit. So that will continue to be a challenge. And for as long as I've been in the business, replenishing that smaller lot inventory has been a chronic challenge. So this is sort of depicting that. What you're looking at here is essentially the Washington County new home market. The distribution there, you can see it's a skewed distribution. Our median is clustered around and below roughly the $500,000 home price. The red bars are the vacant developed lot inventory, and the gray bar is new home starts. And so if you look at that in most product segments, most price bands, we have some lot inventory on the ground. The red bar is taller than the gray bar. That means that as we start those higher end homes, there is lot inventory behind that to replace that. So that higher end segment of the market actually is functioning relatively well. The constraint is what we all know the constraint is, which is replacing those lots that will allow us to produce a home below that median in any serious way. And maybe most depressing of all, we have almost no inventory anymore below $350,000. So we're here to talk about policy, of course. That was kind of really the impetus of the land use task force. Is none of this stuff can change by just talking about it. We actually have to get in under the hood of the policy that is the DNA, the operating system of our housing market and our land use generally. And you are the folks that are equipped to do that. It takes technical expertise, and for better or worse, we're it. But I did want to kind of unpack a little bit some of the, we know you guys have sort of an iceberg below the surface that we don't see. We want to share a little bit of the iceberg of development that maybe the cities don't see. So gonna rip off a paper that was published by the UCLA Lewis Center to engage in a little bit of a thought experiment with you. So one way of measuring your capacity is by parcel. So simple thought experiment where you have a small town, homes sell for $400,000, the lots are $200,000, and to build a home it costs $200,000. So the hypothetical is a method is invented that cuts the cost of construction in half. And the question becomes, what happens? What happens to home prices? What happens to lot prices? And like any good attorney, the answer is it depends. If there are many vacant lots, then home prices are likely to fall. So for example, if you had five home buyers, 5 prospective home buyers, folks that either grew up, wanted to move out from home or were trying to move into the town, and you had many lots, say you had 50 vacant lots, none of those lot owners are going to have pricing power, and therefore you're going to be able to build a house now for $300,000 instead of $400,000. You can buy the lot still for $200,000, now you can build your house for $100,000. But if for those 5 homes, 5 home buyers, prospective home buyers, if there's only 7 or 8 lots, what's going to happen? Probably the money's going to go to the lot, right? Rather, so because now there's such a constrained supply, you're still no worse off than you were before. You still are paying the $400,000 or up to the $400,000 for your land with the structure on top of it. But now less is going to the home structure and more is going into the land. So just to illustrate at a little more granular level how this works on a parcel basis. So, and this plat, you might recognize it, it's the first St. George plat from 1862. And so what we did for a long time is we subdivided these lots. And if you travel around downtown St. George, there are not that many of these lots left. There's 8 lots per block. They're 8/10 of an acre each. And there just aren't that many anymore. So for a long time, what did we do? We're not a literal island, so we grew at the edges of town. And we also subdivided each of these large 8/10 of an acre lots. What has happened over the last half century across the country is that as cities reach the edge of where they can comfortably expand horizontally, they've also stopped, in many cases, subdividing more intensively within their urban footprint. So we're going to take a little trip to a couple of cities, a couple that are closed access cities, to see what that looks like. So we're talking about a zoning buffer, right? So we've got to have a ton of slack in terms of our zone capacity so that there's always an abundance of land to put into the process. At one time, LA had a zoning buffer about 4 times what its population was, but they systematically downzoned that out of existence. New York City was the same way. At one time, they had a 7 times zoning buffer and also eliminated that systematically. So in both cases, by the 2000s, they had just kind of put a very tight lid on their ability to grow, and their housing prices have exploded as a consequence. To the point where by one metric, 40% of the buildings in Manhattan you couldn't rebuild if you took them down today. They're non-conforming, which is a very common situation. And part of what I want to underline here, and it kind of goes to your question, Natalie, this buffer, what we approve is becomes a lot more complicated. What becomes more feasible, the piece of the approval process is only one step in a much more complicated development equation. And so oftentimes we think, well, and frankly, LA, I mean, a 300,000 population zoning buffer, cities don't grow by 12%, that ought to be enough, right? But the reality is it is just too tight of a lid. Contrast that with an open access city, and this is Houston. They're famous for growing extensively, right? They're famous for their sprawl, but even they have built a city where there used to be a parking lot. So in the 70s, there wasn't much of a city there. Today there is. And as an aside, so Metro Houston actually permits more homes per year than the entire state of California, and it's not close. Just so again, we talk about the scale of what we're talking about here. And again, Utah is pretty good on this metric. We're not really a closed access state. Salt Lake City, for example, is permitting more housing than any other city in Salt Lake County, even though they were quote unquote built out decades ago. So let's check in, bringing it back home to Washington County. So we have, at a top line, we have a reasonably healthy buffer of about 2 times. The number I think that has been thrown around is in that range of 70,000 approved lots, whatever, however we decide to define that. And that's about how many existing housing units we have today. So, on its face, that seems like more than enough, right? That's going to take us 20, 30 years to ever absorb that. We've got 15 master plans with 1,000 plus future lots. Those are the pins you see on the map there. And the other good news about these projects is that we are seeing more housing variety in them. And we're seeing them being developed at population densities that will allow these areas to become a little bit more complete communities that are dense enough to support a little bit of commercial and civic uses and so forth. So that's all healthy. That's good for traffic and water use and all of the rest of it. But where we have a huge opportunity is to increase our intensive capacity. We can continue to go out into the county. I don't think Austin's wrong about that, but he highlights the challenge, and the discussion you guys had is right on point. The difficulty there is the capital part of it. It's incredibly expensive to do. The land is cheap, but the infrastructure is anything but. But there is an opportunity here. Again, and this is not to pick on St. George. All of our cities have this opportunity to one degree or another. Our only real option now is kind of a spot upzoning mechanism. All cities have some version of a plan development ordinance that is better suited to a suburban setting and a greenfield setting. And so we're sort of slugging this out one parcel at a time. A lot of risk, a lot of time, a lot of money goes into this, and a lot of controversy because you're doing it, again, one parcel at a time, one zone change application at a time. And one piece that is really, I think, invisible that I want to highlight next is what that causes is a complete breakdown for a land market. There's no ability to reach agreement with the existing landowner. So all of this is to get to a proposition that we have room here to considerably raise our zoned capacity within our existing urban footprint. And that second, and we'll get to this next, the best way to do that is through a broad upzoning effort, and especially if our primary goal is to get to affordability. So coming back to an example from that UCLA paper I mentioned, I bring this one out because I think because it's so extreme, because they're so much further along in terms of their housing dysfunction, it really teases out well this element. So again, LA's in the same dynamic. Everything again has a really tight lid on it. Any upzone is done on a spot basis. And so this is an example where they had essentially a transit-oriented area. So they were putting in a light rail station in this area, and they said, okay, in this very narrow area, we're going to upzone this limited number of lots. And by the way, since we're putting all this money into the light rail, we're not going to upzone them a little bit. We're going to upzone them a lot. And so 15 single-family lots becomes 455 apartments. So it's a gigantic leap, right? What happens? 2 things. One, there's a private windfall. So those homes that got upzoned at that increment sold for 50 to 100% premium relative to their neighbor across the street because of this upzone. The second thing is that, again, they're further along on this and they're aware that this happens. The city's like, well, we're gonna capture some of that uplift in value, and so we're going to require affordable housing. It's a great mission. It's passes the smell test in terms of being a worthy cause, right? So you get 52 apartments for extremely low income households there. The problem with that is the second piece of that is that only functions through essentially a hidden subsidy between the 4 market rate units and the low income. Those are being subsidized in between those 2 units, right? And so it can work in a broken housing market, but it's predicated on a broken housing market. If you don't have the rents in those market rate units to provide that cross subsidy, the whole thing falls apart. So there's a problem with that. And secondly, how do you calibrate that? You know, if you could make the argument that, well, if the value capture element was calibrated better, that windfall would not have been realized by those homeowners. They would have they had to sell their lots for what the value was pre-zone change. But this is the very difficult thing that happens. And again, to come back to the main point of this, the only reason that windfall was there was because housing was constrained everywhere else around it. So again, the argument is that if you have a broader upzone, then you're essentially creating more available land within your existing system. So the argument is to update our operating system essentially. And it doesn't have to be scary. Everybody in this room has heard the missing middle conversation 100 times, maybe more. The 30-second version of that is a term coined by Daniel Paralek a decade or so ago, and it's really identifying a range of housing types that were legal prior to the way we do zoning today, that have been systematically made extinct by the way we do our zoning now. And the way we do our zoning now is, as you guys know, it's Euclidean. It's a specific kind of zoning paradigm. The kinds of things that we're talking about here are duplexes. I mean, it starts really with an ADU at the very bottom end and tops out at sort of a 3-story courtyard smallplex, sometimes called, say, a 12-unit or so apartment at the tall end of that, maybe with a little bit of commercial in the bottom, a little live-work unit or something comparable to that. So that's essentially kind of the goal. How do you get there? And again, this doesn't have to be scary. So the conventional operating system that we're working with is, you guys know, it's often called Euclidean, named after the city in Ohio that went to the Supreme Court, established zoning as constitutionally legitimate. There are a few hallmarks about it, though. It's relatively inflexible. It's proscriptive. Its focus is on defining and separating uses. And so if you want a new use, you've got to essentially write a new section. And so lately, again, cities have made an effort. I've seen, I'm familiar with several cities that are locally that have considered R14 zones, for example. Let's figure out a smaller lot option here. But as I hear you discuss it, you run up against, I think, a valid concern. Well, if we do R14, how does this work? Are we essentially concentrating everything in one area, creating neighborhoods that are not going to age well, et cetera? So both from sort of aesthetic and economic reasons, you guys are bumping your heads against that, and I think for good reason. But again, that's because you're working within that operating system. If you want to create more lots, you've got to create a new zoning section for that. What we'd like to suggest is that we shift away from that to a more form-based orientation that gives you a little bit more flexibility within each of those brackets. So, for example, right now, Salt Lake City is involved in a similar process to this. They're taking about 28 of their existing chapters in their zoning ordinance and condensing those to 6. They've realized that they've got a lot of inconsistencies and redundancies and complications across those 28 ordinances that they could really simplify down to both the benefit of the development process on both sides of the table. It's taken a lot of their staff time to weed through applications that are typically inadequate because they're trying to navigate a very complicated maze. And you still are establishing bracketed boundaries around it, so it's not taking the lid entirely off. It's just raising the bucket a little bit, the lid on the bucket, putting everything in a little bit bigger bucket, and giving you a little bit more latitude within that. So the invitation to act is to stop tinkering within the existing scheme, but start with a blank sheet of paper and build a modern operating system for the way we do land use. And one of the first light bulb moments for me, as in this evolving conversation that we've been having, happened about 1.5 years ago. We had a spring conference down here with the Utah Land Use Institute, and there was a session on keeping ordinances up to date. What are the challenges, et cetera. And it was one of the moderators was from Envision Utah, and he had us take kind of a live, real-time survey. And it was more city folks than builders and developers in the room. And one of the questions was something about what are the challenges with your existing ordinances and keeping them updated. And what kept popping up was they're complicated, they're inconsistent, we're getting new directives from the state every year, we can't keep up. And another question was a prompt to the effect of what could be done to make it easier. And something that came up more than once was, man, if somebody could give us a template, some sort of template that we could work off of, so that because we're already buried administering the system we have today, we don't also have the bandwidth to create a whole new vehicle. And so prior to that, I'd always figured that cities would just not be in favor of any sort of process like that. But that was a moment where I was like, maybe there is more appetite to collaborate and create a better mechanism for this. And again, the graphic is it's a generic graphic from the field of economics. You have sustaining innovations, and that's what a lot of our efforts have been focused on. They've been tinkering within the existing format we've done. And originally, it makes some sense to separate an industrial use from a school, right? And that's Euclidean zoning at the beginning. But we're now figuring out, okay, an 8,000 square foot lot better not be next to an 10,000 square foot lot, it loses its diminishing returns fiddling with that. The other nuance to this I want to just underline real quick as I go by it is that part of what creates, I think, controversy and opposition to new housing is the expectations that we've built up over decades around the lack of change that we should experience as a city. Historically, that was not normal. Again, we covered this a few minutes ago. Historically, cities evolve both at their edges and within their existing footprint. And over time, we've gradually trained people to think that no, your neighborhood is established once, it never changes, the end. But we know that's not realistic as a practical matter. Even if the built form doesn't change, we know that kids grow up, they move out. So your neighborhood is changing within those walls anyway, and there's no reason that we shouldn't allow our built form to also evolve along with that. And so I think if we establish better expectations, and I think our zoning paradigm establishes the premise for that conversation, and I think if we establish a better premise, we can address some of the concern and opposition to new housing at the root. So there's a draft framework. So again, as Sean emphasized, we're here to listen and take your prompts as much as anything. We have no decision-making authority per se. We are your technical experts, and we have to get direction from the folks that actually have to pass the policy. And so we are here to listen as much as anything, but we also know that you rely on us for that technical expertise. And so this is, again, not the entire agenda of everything we're working on, but as one important plank, we'd like to invite you into a process whereby we could create essentially a draft, a model ordinance around form-based principles at sort of a regional level across the county. Any cities that want to, again, it's permission-based. If you want to opt out, that's obviously your right. But if a city wants to get involved in this process, then we could draft that sort of code. And again, that'd be a very interactive process. I don't know how long it would take. I don't know how much expertise we'd have to bring in from outside. But I know it can be done. We have examples even locally. We have in St. George a section of their code that it already is a decent running start at this. The other thing I'd also underline as I go by is it would be imperative to include civil engineering components of this. So oftentimes our land use isn't even zoning, it's dictated by our various utility departments or our fire safety departments, et cetera. And so that's got to be involved in the process. As we got to the end of that, ultimately it still would be up to each individual city to adopt that and in what format they chose to do it. So they could modify it to fit their unique context. To backtrack a little bit, so the basic concept is what you're doing is you're defining your city a little bit more the way the norm was historically, where your center is more dense, it's more lively, the built form can look different, and as you move away from that, it naturally becomes a little lighter. And so at some point you decide at what level of intensity even makes sense for your city, but I do think every city has at least some parts of the city where one or more of these zones could be an appropriate way to approach land use. And the second thing that can be of comfort to you is that you can adopt these as an overlay zone, so you don't have to abandon your existing ordinances. Flagstaff, I'm showing here, they've gone down this road before, and that's essentially what they did. So if your property is going to sit in, if it's in one of these transect districts, it's going to have both the Euclidean designation and a form-based designation, and you as the property owner can opt into whichever one makes sense to you. So again, you can have both designations. You don't have to abandon what you've got. And then the idea in the back end of this is, again, the body that we've built is meant to continue to iterate. We're never done. We'd try to fix, tweak as we went along. To make this one step more concrete, here's a form-based code example. So the upper right-hand corner, that's straight from the Flagstaff ordinance. You just say what building types are allowed within this particular district. So this is one of their neighborhoods. It's not right downtown, but it's kind of downtown adjacent. And they've designated a broader selection of housing types, right? So these are missing middle forms. One of those on there you'll see is a bungalow court. That's the picture you're seeing on the lower left. If your city says, I kind of like that, this is Seattle, so they get to have grass, and we don't, but the form we really like. You can put that you can figure out what district that goes into, put that on that list, and then you show it. You show it what it is in idealized form. It's less work for lawyers and more work for planners. Our ordinances today are dense legalese. It becomes a lot more graphic, and then you show it in idealized form and then define its setbacks, height, et cetera, the way you ordinarily do. Few supplementary ideas as I'm wrapping up here. You can, some cities have developed essentially a set of a pattern book of pre-approved plans. So you essentially are doing your design control ahead of time as a city. So if that's important to you, if it's important to you to decide your paint colors, et cetera, you can establish some of that and create plans that fit these niches that are essentially pre-vetted, developed, and it creates a fast track and reduces a lot of uncertainty and cost and time for a developer that wants to build this kind of thing. These are just a couple of examples of that. Another thing that would be important on the back end of this is to cultivate an ecosystem of small-scale developers and builders. These are options that can even be self-developed. So the barrier to entry is much lower. These are the same kind of construction as we have for single-family homes, and in fact, up to a fourplex can be financed the same as a single-family home in terms of the underwriting. So there's a lot of benefits to this as well. As Sean alluded to, I think there's also the opportunity to reach out and garner additional resources around this, either in the form of funding, or as he mentioned, maybe cities that opted into a process like this could get essentially safe harbor on your moderate income housing plan. I know that's a headache that causes you untold amounts of time and hassle as a city. So maybe that's something like that we could put on the table. Then just to wrap up, this is just a case study. This is a very, I hope it's nobody's lot in here, but completely unremarkable property. They're all over our town. This one happens to be a block or so from where I live. And being in the line of work I can't walk by it without thinking what could be there. It's one home, $430,000 is what's on the tax roll. And just one scenario, you could put 4 homes like the one you see down the lower right that would essentially be printing money for your government, you're five-folding your taxable value with no additional real impact in infrastructure, and I think enhances the neighborhood. The thing I would point out though is, it still has to pencil, so if I can make you put developer goggles on for just a second, just quick back of the envelope math on this. If you paid the taxable value for the land, and we talked about the importance of that, whether you're doing this, if this is the only lot in town you can do this, you're probably not going to be able to get it for that, but there's another lot down the street. These are unremarkable lots. They're all over our towns. So that becomes an important thing. The second thing is, you've got to provide enough enough headroom that it makes sense. So by the time you pay for the lot, the improvements are probably going to be a minimum of $150,000. These infill lots have to be over excavated to get compaction, et cetera. You pay your 4 impact fees. It's another $120,000. Build the homes. Your break even on these is still going to be around $550. So, and on a sour note, but hopefully the picture at least got you a little bit excited. So that wraps up what I wanted to get on the table.
Tried to advance the concept of form-based zoning in my own community. The resistance to that is not all coming from the city council. The housing market has identified these walled-in developments as the safe, secure purchase for a home buyer, and that's why we get them. We've had, and I don't remember how long ago we did this. I lost my, oh, there it is. I don't remember how long ago we did this, but we established a traditional neighborhood zone that allowed for multiple lot sizes, multiple house prices, and so forth. You know how many times we've had anybody file with that? 0. So it's going to take something to come up with the definition of form-based zoning that works. The development community traditionally has opposed form-based zoning because it comes across as, here's what you have to build in this area of our city, rather than, hey, we want to come in and tell you what we want to build, you somehow fit it into your scheme of zoning, and we find some midpoint and off you go. You build your wall around the whole thing, and it's people who can afford a $450,000 home that live there. And what we've lost in that is when you think about a traditional neighborhood that included all socioeconomic groups. The kids are living 2 doors down in the small house, right? That belonged to some grandma that passed away. We don't have that anymore. So in my own town, recently, there was a developer that acquired a piece of school district property, and they did one different thing. Now, the houses, I think, are very similarly priced still. But instead of building a wall around the whole thing, because they weren't on a major collector in this case, they simply fronted the homes that were along our 200 West Street to the street. It's amazing to drive through that area and feel the difference of having houses face the street rather than everything being behind walls. You see the tops of the windows and the roof, from the street, and that's it, and then some streetscape. And we call that good planning. Frankly, I think it's terrible planning. So what I would like to see, because I agree completely with you, Stacy, on this point, is for us to, first of all, how many of you even understand what form-based zoning is? Several of you do. Most of you do not. It's an entirely different concept than trying to pigeonhole a project into this size lot, this size lot, this size lot, duplex, multifamily, whatever. And when you look at the town that if not you grew up in, that your parents or your grandparents grew up in, it's likely that it had a texture that was very community. You know what we've lost with traditional zoning? Community. I mean, we are a community. We get together for our Heritage Days every year. But other than that, everybody drives into their walled community, and we see each other at church and occasionally at the grocery store. So I would hope that we could really latch on to this idea, help everybody understand what form-based zoning, I mean, historically, it's been used in a very rigid way that was not a particular advantage to a developer. What Stacy's describing is a far more open type that would allow a community, as he said, to develop naturally with a mixture of different socioeconomic homeowners and a far greater sense of community than we have with this 10 acres walled in, this 10 acres walled in. Now we have Cayenne out there that isn't walled in, but once again, it is a socioeconomic strata because there's only the top 2% of buyers that can afford that size of a lot in that kind of an environment with that size and price of a home.
Great comments. One thing I would sort of tack onto the community comment is, I think that also is the genesis of a lot of the NIMBYism, we'll just say the word. We made it pretty far.
Not a swear word.
We made an hour and a half today, so that's pretty good. But I think within that is, I can't remember who coined the adage, but someone said if what your selling point is exclusivity, each additional person diminishes that amenity. If your amenity is community, each additional person adds to that amenity. So it's changing almost that definition of amenity from exclusivity to community.
I have a question. One of the things you mentioned was talking about overlays. So when we were talking about the neighborhood subforms, phase 1 being a form-based code, phase 2 being neighborhood subforms, how is this all that different from the overlay zones that we've seen done, like in downtown St. George and some of these other areas? Can you maybe expand on, it sounds to me it's a little bit like what we already have. I know we have, there's like some traditional zone overlays in certain areas in St. George that are off St. George Boulevard up to like 100 South or something like that. How is this different from what we've kind of tested out already?
It's a great question.
Thank you.
Luckily, there's technical experts in the room, so we can get pretty technical. I think the overlay you're referring to is actually the downtown plan, which is just a general plan. So that's our kind of 20 or 30 year vision as a community. It's adopted by the city. The zoning is still Euclidean, so it's not an overlay per se. And that's where also a lot of controversy arises too, is oftentimes as developers, for one reason or another, the zoning isn't caught up to the general plan. And so we come in sometimes with an application that is going to bring the land use of a given parcel into conformity with the general plan, but it's currently zoned ag or it's zoned something like that, and the neighbors are, oh, somebody's getting away with something here. This is ag property. But in fact, the long range vision of this was always going to be that. So the distinction is that. So we're talking about general plan versus an overlay actual zone. To tack on one little additional detail to that, so the section of the Flagstaff ordinance I pulled up, for example, that might be suitable for in the new downtown plan, and Carol can fix me when I get this wrong, but I think it's the traditional neighborhood, so the stuff that's off of our main corridor, that might be an area where that would make some sense. So my neighborhood in Sandtown, areas like that where you've got the kinds of properties I showed you.
So it would be almost an in between. It would be an in between the general plan and that. Would it still have a general plan attached to it as well? But you're just across the city, you'd have something that's a little bit more updated that doesn't need a zone change per se before development happens. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly. So these are actual zones. So yeah, as long as you're compliant within that ordinance, you'd be able to go forward. And I think it kind of goes to part of the point that Mayor Hart raised. I think part of the issue in the past with the form-based adoption has been we're still applying it in kind of a suburban setting, and so or in a larger a larger parcel setting where it was, the natural inclination was to build a specific kind of product, where what we're talking about here is much more granular, where we're talking about 1 or 2 lots. You're not necessarily talking about a larger piece of property.
One thing I can say is Stacy does practice what he preaches, because he did take a larger parcel in downtown St. George and subdivided that and built in what is now like the RCC zone, is what they call overlay. I've been kind of grassrootsing with that with Stacy, and I think St. George did a great thing by doing that. I've kind of seen it firsthand work. I'm doing some homes on 389 South, 200 West in St. George. And if you go look at them, everyone actually really likes them. They're on 5,000 square foot lots. We're sub 2,000 square foot on home with an ADU. And I get phone calls on it nonstop about people wanting to buy them, but also neighbors wondering what it is. And I kind of explain it to them, and without fail, I got a text here today from a neighbor that's, hey, I have a parcel down here. It's 15,000 square feet, 20,000 square feet. I would love to do something like that, so I have something for my kids to live in. So I know that it's kind of a weird thing when people first see it, because they're skinny. It's very urban living looking. But I can tell you firsthand that it does work, and a lot of the people that are surrounding that downtown area really support it. They really like it. You're not getting this isn't what I have. It's more, I've had this acreage. I don't use it. I'm older. I want to be able to provide this for my kids. So I would love to see it implemented in all the cities, because when I go and I build all over, but when I go into Hurricane, Washington, Hurricane, all these places, that you see these older homes on large parcels, and I think this is a huge niche that we could use that would really help build our infield and kind of get new and vibrant and walkable communities and things like that. So it's not really a question, but just a vouch for it. 389 South, 200 West, St. George.
I just want to ask, I'm curious about price points, because Stacy showed your example. I've been on the committee for quite a while with the group here. That price point was $550,000. That's still not meeting the affordability that's been given to us by the state, which is a range of $350,000 to $450,000. What are the price points? What are you talking about?
So I did one, and I did it right next to Stacy, and I think she'll be okay with me sharing this. I built it right next door to Stacy. This is the first one we did, and we sold it at $375,000.
And was that recently?
Yeah, it wasn't a year ago.
Did that come with an ADU?
That one did not have an ADU. These ones in downtown on 389 South, 200 West, they do have an ADU on them, and we're hoping for that 500 price point.
See, that's a little high.
But
you got to
yeah, with the new financing incentives.
Or you're going to get some of their mortgage back.
Yeah, they are able to get approved for quite a bit more, because they can use projected rent income towards that mortgage. So it's a great thing, and it makes the community a walkable community. These people don't really need big yards. They go and utilize city parks. They walk to the grocery store. I know parking's always a big thing for cities, but in my experience, I'm seeing like people actually, they walk. They use public transportation, they ride bikes, they do things like that. So if anyone ever wanted to drive by in the city, kind of see, touch, feel the product, like I really do believe it's a great thing moving forward.
Yeah, to check in also real quick, Jim. So one of the reasons I subjected you guys to this laborious thing today is also to get at 2 issues that really affects price point. One is if this is applied broadly, as opposed to the way we do it now on a lot by lot basis, Jordan today has little or no bargaining power. There's one parcel, and he's going to have to put all of his eggs in that basket. And so, who's going to capture a bigger share of the value created? is going to be the landowner. If he can choose from multiple parcels, he now has a better opportunity to get that land at a different price on the front end, which is huge. And then the back end is what I highlighted. How many, when we calibrate this, we've got to be realistic about how many homes, what forms are actually going to be feasible in a given context, because that's the other end of it, right?
I would add to that too. If you look at the testimony that was given the other day in the interim committee, one of the points that was made was it's cost prohibitive for a lot of people in existing homes to build an ADU. It costs them $100,000 plus to do an ADU. If we had more builders who built ADUs when they build the new homes, that would help a lot of those new homeowners, as was said here, to be able to get that financed with their home, knowing that they can apply that rent that they're going to get from that to their mortgage payment, so that might help.
Easier to get the utilities right and everything too. I can get it.
One challenge with all this. So I mean, we talked about wanting to implement changes at the city level with zoning and changes on the market level with builders or developers or whatever. But you try to implement some of this type of change. One of the things that nobody ever talks about is that every time you go into submit a plan for a new community, the city always requires that you have CCNRs, homeowners association, et cetera. Like every single community, it's part of the requirements. You have to do this. But then the city also takes a stance that we don't govern CCNR, we don't govern HOA, et cetera. But it's required. In practicality, what happens is developers go, they call an attorney up, hey, I need CCNR so I can get my final plat approval. The attorney writes up a set of CCNRs. They're almost always boilerplate, which usually means they're copied from the most restrictive community in the neighborhood. And usually the developer just cursory glance at it, very, very little time looking into it and says, okay, what really does this impose on this land? They get recorded, the city doesn't look at them ever again, but what happens is you get a lot of your not my backyard attitudes stemming from the CCNRs that were recorded there. You try then as a city to implement some of these things like ADUs or, changing densities and zoning, but you've got now this set of CCNR deed restrictions limiting all this stuff, and it causes a huge backlash where even if you try to implement it on the city level, it can't happen in practicality, and then you get all the people at city council with their pitchforks and everything saying this is against my CCNRs, et cetera, and it just causes a gigantic mess. I mean, I'm planning commission, and every time we have something, we always have people coming in saying, why won't the city enforce my CCNR? This is not allowed. And at the same time, we're having conversations of how can we make housing more affordable, how can we allow more flexibility like this, but nobody ever talks about the fact that the city requires the CCNRs, which then cause
what
the
city
problem.
requires that?
Yeah, and
Only if there's common ground.
And I would, because I think that's a good point, Mayor, because Corey, what I was gonna say is that when I first got here 21 years ago, maybe that was the case, but we have a city manager that also was our planning director and has lived through this. And I think you'll see that the cities have changed their fundamental view of doing PUDs and CCNRs for those small types of things. And I'm just going to let John say a few words. There's only a few times you can put your boss on the spot, right? So
I would say a few things. One is St. George. We did the downtown plan. It was a good plan. I think there's a lot of benefits there. We're now looking at what the next step is, which is the zoning aspect of it. And we have looked at form-based code being kind of that basis for what the zoning is going to look like in the downtown area. I think we do see there's a lot of potential to build downtown. The benefit you have downtown is you already have the impact fees, and all that was talked about, but you also have property that's already being watered. We have 60% of the water being used on landscaping. In its place, you could put a unit, and it would have minimal impact on our water supply. But the downtown also has infrastructure problems. We have sewer problems downtown, we have other problems, and so there is a lift as far as infrastructure goes downtown, both from power and sewer. And so that is something that would need to be addressed. We did create a form-based code with T&Z, and you've seen it done out in Desert Color, and Desert Color has done an excellent job, but it's not affordable. And so I don't think that a form-based code automatically equals affordability. It creates a great product, but I do think the supply issue needs to be addressed. One variable that we have in our downtown area is that's where all of our historic buildings are at. That's where our historic homes are at, our landmark sites, and it's a delicate balance of not over entitling those properties to where an investor or developer wants to go in and remove those buildings to build a fourplex. And so where's that balance? How do you encourage an increase in density, but also not lose the character that makes St. George, St. George? And so the downtown area is it's a very unique, there's a lot of opportunities, there's a lot of variables. There's also a little bit of challenges we need to look at. There are also other areas that we can look at. There's some areas on the west side that could definitely use some revitalization. I could see some form-based code being applied in that area that could really benefit that area. And so I think St. George, as far as zoning goes, we've been fairly progressive. We've done a lot of things to help encourage a variety of housing types. We've done lot size averaging. We've done all sorts of things, and I think we need to continue to move in that direction and continue to look at those innovations to help encourage more housing supplies and create more communities and more neighborhoods and not just subdivisions.
Sean, I'm standing up.
And Corey, what I want to say before I hand over the mic here is it used to come to our land use task force meetings, and this is the type of thing that we would want to hear at our land use task force meetings, because if there are cities that still, because a lot of us fall back onto the old ways of doing things, especially the smaller cities, because that's just the way it's always been done, and they don't have the staff to actually revamp and change these. But these are all good points that you were making. If we have communities that are still doing that, let's
look at all the communities like for the last 30 years we've had. I understand if you're in downtown and you've got some really old homes, that's much easier to implement this on. But on communities like all the ones that we're still approving, I mean, you look right there on the list of requirements, and there's always, there's that list, especially if you have any common, common amenities or common, items that need to be taken care of, which there always are, because now we've required LID and all these other things. So you always have to have some sort of association, and it's just in practice, what happens is you end up with a second set of laws that supersede all the stuff that we're trying to do. That's all I'm just saying. We just kind of ignore the fact that there's this artificial, government that's being in place on top of all this with the HOA. And I have tons of people that have come and wanted to build an ADU, wanted to do this and that just for their kids, where the city's like, sure, it's fine, it's allowed, the state's like, yeah, it's allowed. The HOA says no, and they run them right out of the neighborhood. I mean, I've got numerous examples of that happening all the time. Right. The HOAs overrule everything else.
How many here live in an HOA? I'm sorry.
Can you hear? We, when we moved down here about 3 years ago, we had to find a house, and we were able to do that. But it was the 8th one that we had looked at, and it came with a small HOA for front yard landscaping. I didn't want an HOA. I'd never had an HOA before, but I got one, whether I wanted one or not. And those fees have already gone up from $60 a month to $80 a month, and it takes 5 to 10 minutes a week for them to do our front yard because there's this much land, this much sod, and the plants and bushes, but it's still an HOA. I was talking to a council member. I'm from Santa Clara. We have some council members here today, and our planning commission members are here as well. Thank you for being here. We are going to be doing an update to our general plan. We put an RFP out last month, and we've made a decision on that. We'll be moving forward. But in the RFP, we talk about looking at some form-based options as well. So we're talking about this today, looking at some options of form-based code, but I think we want to go through the community, do an inventory and identify places where this would be a possibility. We don't have a lot of the infill opportunities like St. George has, because you guys are the big dog in all of this. But we will be looking at that. I've dealt with form-based. It really is an educational process. There's going to have to be a learning curve here. You've got the transects, you've got all of that. It's not easy. It's different than the standard you put in zoning, but it's something that we can take a look at. The R14 option that's been kicked around, that tool can work as well, and infill zones can work, but those are generally for infill properties, maybe 5 acres or less. I wouldn't want to take down an R14 subdivision of 20 acres. I don't think that's fitting, but in an infill situation, I think it can work. I like the idea of an overlay, and maybe there's a template or a model code that we look at, but each community is going to be different in that. And we've addressed this. I know we adopted our ordinances for water efficient landscaping, and we did that, and we each kind of ran our own play with that. Zach brought us all back home and made us change and made us amend some of that. But I think it's not one size fits all, it's definitely not.
So we're inviting you to come again to our. Great, and right now Representative Walter, who represents the best district in all of Washington County, would like to say a few words, and we'll turn this mic over to you.
Thank you. It's good to be here with everybody. I appreciate the conversation today. I actually love the title of the workshop today, right? This Housing Supply Accelerator. I want to talk about two things that I think can be helpful in this context. The first one is, and I want to be very clear. The first one is a discussion. Okay, this is not a policy. It's not a law. It's not something that it's just a discussion. I want you to think about this for just a moment. We have interesting ways that we restrict demand for specific types of properties. So think about 55 and older community, right? If you want to move into Sun River, you have to meet specific criteria that restrict who can buy in that neighborhood, right? This is not a new concept. It's not an unusual concept. It's not a foreign concept. It's not a violation of free market principles. But one of the big trends that you're all aware of is the growing movement in build for rent, okay? We need all kinds of housing supply. We need rental properties. We need detached rental properties, so single family. We need apartments. We need all kinds of ownership. When we talk about our conversation today is about having a diversity of product. But one of the challenges is a nationwide trend where people are saying, we want to persuade people not to buy, which that's people's individual choice. But there's a lot of competition for units as investment, right? So here's a thought. We create a zone, and the zone essentially says it's only, you can't rent in this zone. HOAs already do this, right? They have restrictions on how this works, but the question is, what does that look like? And is that an appropriate use of zoning authority, state and local municipality ordinances? And so we're thinking about that. There's some interesting things that you might be able to do in that context, but I just want to put that out there as something we're thinking about. When we talk specifically about housing supply, I want to address what I think is the lowest hanging fruit in housing supply today. Many of you know that in Washington County, the Ken Gardner study did a great big study. It was very, very good, very well done study. What it basically says is that 1 out of 4 homes is unoccupied. Okay, 1 out of 5 homes is unoccupied. So we can talk about housing supply. It's actually kind of tricky because we have to build extra homes just to make a housing unit. One of the things that they acknowledged is in their study, they said, we don't know how many additional homes are part of the short-term rental infrastructure, and particularly the non-conforming short-term rental infrastructure. And so one of the things I'm putting on the table this year is a change in state law that would reverse the Not Well rule. The Not Well rule, that's okay, that's okay. Okay, the Not Well rule is a very interesting provision in 2017 that restricted the ability for a municipality to enforce its zoning on what is essentially a hospitality use. It's a commercial use. So if you are in a VRBO, Airbnb, in that short-term rental space, that's technically a commercial use. And what the Notwell rule said, that there are restrictions on a municipality enforcing its zoning ordinance in the context of a non-conforming hospitality use. All I'm proposing to do with this bill is to say the municipality can enforce its zone. And if your zone says you can put short-term rentals in any residential area, which some municipalities in our state do, then that's your zone, that's fine. If your zone says we're going to restrict short-term rentals as a non-conforming use in a residential zone, then that's fine also. Fastest ways we can add supply to our local housing market and take some of the pressure off some of the supply dynamics. So if you have questions about that, I'd love to chat about it. Mayor's got a question here, go ahead.
So another approach to governing both investor-owned housing and STRs is the tax code, and you and your fellow legislators are the only ones that can fix it. So right now we have a primary residence discount essentially on our property tax, right? I keep suggesting the idea that your primary residence ought to be property tax X. If it's a second, third home, whatever, it's double X. If it's an investor-owned property, and that would have to be defined by numbers of properties they own within the state or whatever, it's 3 times X. And if it's an STR, it's 4 times X, or 5, or 10. And that extra property tax could be dedicated to affordable housing. It could be invested in property held in trust and not included in the purchase price of particularly targeted workforce housing. That would dramatically reduce the cost of a home. And there's a way to carry that into perpetuity with deed restrictions and so forth. But nobody ever talks about a very simple, easy way to disincentivize, looking at Councilmember Randall and the point you were making earlier, not Randall, sorry, Tanner, that seems to me so obvious but anyway.
Yeah, so let me I think this is a really, it's an important point, and it's actually a concept that we have in practice. Across the state, it's been poorly managed. So the Washington County Assessor is not here, but they've actually been working really hard to try and address this particular problem. So in state code, if this is a primary residence, it doesn't matter in state code whether it is a primary residence that you as an owner-occupant are living in, or if it is rented. If it's somebody's primary residence, then there is a 45% reduction in the property tax. If it is a second home, if it is a vacation rental, if it is some other use, then you don't get that benefit. The trick is it's very challenging to manage that compliance. And so I think that getting better at this is something that we definitely can do. We can look at some of the, whether it's enough or it needs to be adjusted. One of the things I would be a little bit cautious about is any time we are raising the property tax cost for a tenant in their primary residence, that's eventually going to end up in rent. And we have to be a little bit careful about that. And so, but I do acknowledge that we already have that practice in place, and it's a substantial difference. It's not 2x, but it's close to. But one of our challenges, and something we'll have to continue to work on getting better at, is making sure that we properly identify the homes that are a primary residence that somebody is using versus a second home, an investment property, short-term rental, or some other form of consumption of housing infrastructure. So thank you, Mayor. I actually really appreciate you bringing up that point. It's an important point.
Perfect. Thanks again, everybody, for being here. We're at our time. If anybody wants the slides, we can send those out. We taped it for folks that weren't able to make it today. There's an appendix and a bunch of additional stuff in the back of it. finish off with one little data point that Neil teed up for me. So the crunch numbers was that using kindergartner data, and from the 1970s through 2010, we built 130 new homes for every new 100 households. During the 2010s, we built 85. So
I missed it, Stacy. I missed it. I didn't hear it. I'm sorry.
So for 40 years in the state, for every 100 new households, we built 135 new homes. 130 homes. So again, you have to create capacity. You've got to create a buffer and slack. And in the 2010s, we only built 85 per 100. So that's the iron law of supply and demand is real, guys. Thanks again for coming out.